Hey, Reddit. I'm not really one to spill my life out to strangers, but here I am. I guess I just need somewhere to talk about everything that's happened because, honestly, my life's been turned completely upside down. My name's Michael. I'm 38, married to Jennifer, I was, more on that later, and we have 2 kids. We met in college and had one of those whirlwind romances where you just know you found your person. I still remember our first date, back when we were both just a couple of broke kids trying to figure out life. We were sitting at this little dive bar by campus, talking about everything from career dreams to starting a family, and I thought, yeah, this is it. She was the kind of person I could see myself building a life with, and for the longest time, I thought that's exactly what we did. After college, we built our lives from the ground up. I got my first real job, then a promotion, and eventually a career that let me give my family a nice life. Jennifer found work she was passionate about too. I was so proud of us, of what we managed to make of ourselves. And through all those years, I was convinced we had this unbreakable bond. We talk about growing old together, all that stuff that sounds cliché but feels real when you're in it. And for a while, I think we were both happy, at least I know I was. Every bit of myself, I put into our family and making sure we had a good life. But about a year ago, things started to shift. Nothing drastic at first, just small things that added up. Jennifer became more distant, emotionally, physically. She used to be affectionate, always reaching for my hand or leaning in close when we talked. Then, it was like she barely even looked at me anymore. She'd brush me off whenever I tried to talk, telling me she was stressed or tired. I figured it was a phase, you know? Everyone's busy, life gets hard. I didn't think much of it at first. But it kept going. She'd stay late at work more and more, saying she had some big project. I tried to be supportive, but something didn't sit right. There was this coldness in her I'd never seen before, like she was there but her mind was somewhere else entirely. I'd see her on her phone constantly, smiling and laughing at messages she wouldn't share with me. When I'd ask, she'd get defensive, brushing it off with just work stuff or nothing interesting. Then came the sudden business trips. They started popping up out of nowhere, without much explanation. I'd ask where she was going or what the trip was for, and her answers always felt vague. And here's the thing, I trusted her. Or at least, I wanted to. So I'd just nod and pretend her answers made sense, trying to ignore this growing feeling in my gut that something was off. One weekend in particular stands out. Jennifer had told me she'd be out of town for a conference, and I didn't question it. But when she came back, there was something different about her. She wouldn't look me in the eye. She'd walk around the house like she was trying to avoid me, barely saying a word. I brushed it off, trying to be the understanding husband, telling myself it was just work stress or exhaustion from traveling. But then I found it, a hotel receipt crumpled in her purse, like it had been shoved in there in a hurry. I wasn't snooping, but she'd left her bag on the counter, and something told me to take a peek. It wasn't even the hotel she'd told me she'd be staying at. I looked at the date, the location, and then I noticed the room was booked for 2 people. That was the first real punch to the gut. I felt my stomach drop, and everything around me got quiet. I could feel my heart pounding as I stared at that receipt, like somehow, staring at it hard enough would make it disappear. I wanted to believe there was some other explanation, something innocent, but what was I supposed to think? My wife had been at a hotel she didn't tell me about, with another person. I didn't want to jump to conclusions, but the thought of her with someone else made me feel sick. Still, I didn't confront her right away. I didn't even know where to start. We'd been together so long, built this life together, and the idea of tearing that apart, it was too much. So I shoved it all down, convincing myself I needed more proof, something concrete. What if I was wrong? What if it was just a misunderstanding, and I ended up destroying everything over nothing? So I started paying closer attention. I'd watch her out of the corner of my eye, noticing every little change. She'd come home after those late nights at work, and I swear she had this look in her eyes, something between guilt and detachment. She'd brush me off when I'd try to talk to her, acting like I was just paranoid or clingy. And every time I'd bring up those weekend trips or the late nights, she'd get defensive, almost angry, telling me I was overreacting. The final straw came a few months later. I came home from work one evening and she was out, saying she'd be back late. By now, I'd gotten used to her disappearing for hours, so I didn't think much of it. But something in me, call it instinct, told me to check our joint credit card statement. I pulled it up on my phone and there it was. Dinner charges at a restaurant we'd never been to, on nights she was supposedly working late. Hotel charges that didn't match any business trips she'd told me about. And what really got me? A charge for an expensive bottle of wine, her favorite kind, that I knew she'd never splurge on if it was just her. I remember just sitting there, staring at those charges, feeling like the ground had been pulled out from under me. Everything I'd ignored, every little sign, it all came crashing down. I couldn't deny it anymore. Jennifer wasn't just working late or stressed, she was hiding something, and she'd been lying to me for who knows how long. But I needed more than just receipts. I needed proof, something undeniable. So I hired a private investigator. It felt surreal, like something out of a bad movie, but I didn't see another way. I told myself it was the only way to find out the truth, even if that truth shattered everything I thought I knew about her, about us. And what the investigator found? Well, that's a story of its own. But let's just say, it was worse than anything I could have imagined. So, the investigator didn't take long to dig up what I was afraid of. I thought maybe he'd find a few suspicious dinners or hotel stays, but it was so much more than that. Turns out, Jennifer had practically been leading a double life. She wasn't just sneaking around once in a while, she'd been having multiple affairs. Not one, but several people, including her boss. It was like every worst-case scenario I'd shoved to the back of my mind was coming true, and all at once. I remember the PI calling me up to tell me he'd found something significant, and asking if I wanted to meet up to go over the details. I was at work when I got the call, and the rest of my day was a blur. All I could think was, this is it. This is where I finally find out the truth. When I finally left the office, I drove straight to his building, my hands shaking on the steering wheel the whole way there. When I got to his office, he had a folder ready for me. I could barely look him in the eye as he handed it over, part of me too afraid to actually see what was inside. But he told me, gently, it's better to know, no matter how hard it is. So I took a deep breath, opened that folder, and everything just hit me all at once. The first few pages were photos. There was Jennifer with her boss, laughing over some fancy dinner, looking more relaxed than she'd been around me in months. Another shot of them leaving a hotel together, hand in hand. Then there were text transcripts, dozens of messages, way too familiar and way too flirty for just colleagues. My stomach twisted as I read through them, feeling like a stranger was taking over my own life, my marriage. She'd been telling him things she hadn't said to me in years. Words like miss you and can't wait to see you, like he was the one she was coming home to. And it didn't stop there. The investigator had found evidence of other men, other nights at hotels, dinners, and weekends when she was supposed to be at conferences. This wasn't a one-time mistake. This was a whole separate life she'd been living right under my nose, while I was busy trying to keep our family together, our home steady. I went back to my car after that, just sat there with the folder in my lap, staring out the windshield without even seeing anything. It felt like the world had gone silent, like I couldn't even hear my own thoughts over the roar of disbelief and anger. I'd been so sure that if I just loved her enough, gave her enough space, things would be fine. But here I was, holding proof that everything we'd built together was a lie. That trust one thought we had? She'd ripped it apart without a second thought. I don't know how long I sat there, but eventually I made it home. Jennifer was already there, sitting at the kitchen table, casually scrolling on her phone like nothing was wrong. For a second, I thought about confronting her right then and there, dumping the folder on the table and watching her face as she realized she was caught. But as much as I wanted to lash out, something held me back. Maybe it was the kids, who'd be home from school any minute. Or maybe it was that part of me that still wanted to protect her, even after everything. So, instead of blowing up, I took a different approach. I told her I had a work trip coming up, a last-minute thing I had to handle on my own. She barely looked up, just mumbled a "that's fine," like it didn't even register. And I remember thinking, of course it's fine, she's probably glad I'll be out of her way. I didn't really go anywhere, though. I stayed in a cheap motel across town for a couple of days, planning my next moves. I knew I couldn't just confront her and walk away. I needed her to feel even a fraction of the betrayal and loss I was feeling. Those couple of days in the motel felt like a blur of anger, disbelief, and planning. I'd always thought I'd be the type to walk away with my head held high, take the high road, or whatever people say. But seeing those photos, reading those messages, every decent part of me was out the window. She'd lied to me, broken our vows over and over. There was no way I could just leave it at that. So I got to work. First thing I did was meet with my lawyer. I needed to make sure I had every possible angle covered because I wasn't just dealing with Jennifer. I was dealing with the people she'd brought into our lives, the men she'd used to make me feel like a fool. And her boss? That was a special kind of insult. Someone she saw every day, a man I'd met at her work functions, shook hands with, and treated with respect. It made my blood boil just thinking about it. My lawyer went over the options with me, and one thing became clear. I needed to drain our accounts. Jennifer had access to everything: savings, investments, retirement. I'd been trusting, maybe too trusting, and she could easily have taken it all if she wanted to. So, I started shifting things around, making some emergency withdrawals. I set up a new account in my name only, started funneling the money over slowly, making sure it looked like standard expenses. It felt almost surreal, like I was planning a heist in my own life. I'd be on my phone at all hours, keeping track of what I'd moved, making sure I was still in control of our finances. It was a strange feeling, doing all this behind her back while she went on, clueless, living her lie. And it was then that I realized she must have been doing the exact same thing to me for months, if not years. The whole time, looking at me every day, acting like nothing was wrong. But the money wasn't enough. I needed to hit her where it hurt, in a way that would make her realize just how far she'd fallen. So I hired the private investigator again, this time with a different request. I needed him to dig into her boss and her other friends, to get me everything he could on them. If she wanted to throw away our marriage for these people, I'd make sure it came with consequences. The investigator was quick. Within days, he'd gathered evidence of not just her affair with the boss, but of some shady business deals he'd been involved in. Apparently, Jennifer wasn't the only secret he was keeping. I couldn't believe it when the investigator handed me a file full of emails, transaction logs, even a couple of incriminating photos of him with other women. He was risking his job, his reputation, and maybe even his freedom, all while toying with my wife. It was exactly the leverage I needed. So, I filed the first lawsuit against her company. It wasn't a huge case, just enough to get their attention, to make them dig into her and her boss's activities. I claimed breach of privacy, harassment, and damages. I knew it would rattle the company enough to put both of them under scrutiny. The days stretched on, and I kept it all to myself, playing along with her act, letting her think I was oblivious. I'd watch her pack for her business trips and smile, knowing that her world was about to come crashing down, just like she'd shattered mine. I kept going, moving money out of our accounts, getting every possible piece of evidence, slowly tightening the noose. But it was the nights that got to me. I'd sit in that motel room, staring at the ceiling, replaying every moment we'd shared. Every promise she'd made, every "I love yous" that now felt empty. I'd think about the kids, about how they'd look at me with questions in their eyes once everything was out in the open. Part of me wondered if I was going too far. But then I'd remember those photos, those messages. I'd remember how easily she'd lied to my face, and any doubts I had would disappear. Jennifer had destroyed the life we built together, and I was determined to make sure she felt every bit of the fallout. As I kept moving pieces around behind the scenes, Jennifer acted like everything was fine. Maybe she thought she'd gotten away with it, that I was as clueless as I'd been all those months. She'd come home from her business trips with this little smirk, like she had some private joke. She didn't realize the joke was on her. At home, I went through the motions, pretending I hadn't seen the evidence stacked up against her. I'd come home from work, make dinner for the kids, and try to keep things as normal as possible. It was weird, knowing that I was holding this secret, one that would change our lives forever. But if Jennifer noticed anything, she didn't show it. One night, as I was putting the kids to bed, I heard her talking on the phone downstairs. I couldn't make out every word, but the tone was all I needed to hear, playful, flirtatious, completely checked out of our life. I gritted my teeth, staying quiet so the kids wouldn't hear anything. This was my wife, my partner, the woman I thought I'd grow old with, giggling like a teenager over the phone with some other man. The anger burned through me, but I kept my cool. The next day, I decided to confront her, but not directly. Instead, I started dropping subtle hints, just little things to make her wonder. I'd mention a friend who found out his wife was cheating and casually talk about how terrible betrayal is, how I couldn't imagine doing that to someone. I'd notice the way her eyes shifted, a flicker of discomfort crossing her face, but she'd brush it off, laughing it away. I started leaving things around the house, like articles about infidelity, stories about couples who found out the truth. She'd see them and get this nervous look, but never said a word. Around this time, the lawsuit I'd filed started making waves at her office. Jennifer was stressed, on edge. She'd come home late, grumbling about work problems, blaming everything on her boss. "He's such a jerk," she'd say, venting about how poorly things were being managed. She'd go on about how unfair things were, how her company didn't care about the people putting in the hard work. And I'd nod along, biting back a smile, knowing exactly why her boss was in hot water. It didn't take long for the investigation to circle back to her. Apparently, someone had tipped off HR about her relationship with her boss. She never told me this outright, but I could see it on her face. She was distracted, checking her phone constantly, anxiously texting and deleting messages. She'd go from frustration to paranoia, like she knew something was slipping out of her control. One night, after the kids were asleep, she finally let it slip that work was really complicated right now. I pretended to be sympathetic, even though I was practically waiting for her to confess. She kept it vague, saying things like, "I just feel like people are watching my every move, and I don't know who I can trust." The irony wasn't lost on me. I couldn't resist pushing a bit. "Well, maybe it's a good reminder to be honest with the people around you," I said, looking her dead in the eye. Her face went pale for a second before she plastered on a fake smile, brushing it off like she didn't get what I was hinting at. But I could tell it hit her, even if she wasn't willing to admit it. After she went to bed, I checked my emails and saw an update from the investigator. He'd found more dirt on her boss, emails detailing shady deals and manipulative tactics he'd used on other employees. The guy wasn't just a cheater, he was crooked through and through. Knowing that gave me a strange sense of satisfaction. Jennifer hadn't just cheated on me, she'd chosen to betray me for a guy who was willing to throw her under the bus at the first sign of trouble. The best part? I knew it was only a matter of time before everything unraveled for her. I was setting it up so there'd be nowhere for her to run. She was about to watch her whole world crumble, just like I'd watched mine. As the pressure ramped up at her office, Jennifer's behavior grew even more erratic. She was trying so hard to play it cool, but it was clear she was unraveling. She'd come home looking exhausted, snapping at the kids over small things, or staying in our room for hours, glued to her phone. I could feel the tension rolling off her. And honestly, it felt good to see her squirm, to watch her realize that maybe everything wasn't so neatly under control. One Saturday afternoon, I decided to take the kids out to give us some time away from the house. I didn't want them around Jennifer when she was in these moods. We spent the day at the park, grabbed some ice cream, and took our time getting back. I tried to keep my mind on them, enjoying the innocence of just watching them play, laughing without a care in the world. But a part of me was stuck in that anger, that dark place where all I could think about was what Jennifer had done. When we got home, Jennifer was sitting in the living room, scrolling through her phone with a look of pure panic on her face. She didn't even notice us come in until I called her name. She jumped, quickly locking her screen and trying to act normal. I glanced at the kids, who were already running upstairs, oblivious. As soon as they were out of earshot, I asked her if something was wrong. She hesitated, glancing away, then mumbled, "Work's just a mess right now. Some people are saying things about me that aren't true." "Oh, like what?" I asked, feigning concern. Her face turned red as she stumbled over her words. "Just lies. Someone started a rumor that I was involved with someone at work. It's completely ridiculous." I don't even know how people come up with these things. It took everything in me to keep a straight face. Here she was, lying to my face, spinning her little story like she was the victim. I nodded, pretending to believe her. That sounds stressful. I'm sure it'll blow over soon. She seemed to relax a little, probably thinking she'd sold her story. But inside, I was fuming. This woman, the person I'd loved and trusted, was still trying to manipulate me, even when she knew things were falling apart. Later that night, as she was getting ready for bed, I got a message from the private investigator. He'd managed to dig up more proof of her relationship with the boss. Photos, more texts, and details about their little getaways. But he also found something that really surprised me. One of her colleagues had apparently caught on to what was going on between them and had been quietly documenting everything. This person had emails, calendar entries, and even audio recordings of their interactions. That was the break I didn't know I was waiting for. Not only would this information confirm everything I'd suspected, but it would also be coming from someone inside the company. There'd be no denying it, no way for her to dismiss it as some baseless rumor. The next morning, I casually asked her if she'd be working late that week. She looked startled for a second, then shook her head, saying she was done with the overtime for a while. I could see the anxiety in her eyes, the way her gaze darted away from mine, and it was clear she was lying. I almost laughed at the irony. She had no idea that I already knew exactly what she'd been doing during all those late nights. After she left for work, I contacted my lawyer. We started putting together the final pieces for the divorce. I wanted everything set up so that the moment I dropped this bomb on her, there'd be no time for her to react, no chance for her to try and manipulate her way out. I was done with her games, done with all of it. But the real gut punch was yet to come. A few days later, I received a file from the investigator that included one last bit of evidence. Messages between Jennifer and her boss, laughing about how clueless I was, how easy it had been to keep me in the dark. Reading their words, seeing the way she mocked me to him, brought everything to a boiling point. This wasn't just about cheating anymore. It was about how she disrespected me, turned me into a joke in front of someone else. And as much as it hurt, it only made me more determined. Reading through those messages between Jennifer and her boss felt like getting slapped in the face over and over. I kept thinking, how could she do this? How could she be so cruel, so careless with everything we'd built? She wasn't just hiding her affair, she was making a mockery of me, of our life together. It was like all the years, all the memories, had been reduced to nothing but a punchline. I don't know how long I sat there staring at my phone, replaying every ugly detail in my head. But at some point, a strange calm washed over me. I wasn't even angry anymore, I was just done. I'd seen enough. The time for holding back, for playing it cool, was over. So I took things to the next level. I reached out to the PI again, told him I needed hard copies of everything, every message, every photo, every bit of proof he'd found. I was going to hit Jennifer where it hurt, and I needed to make sure she wouldn't be able to talk her way out of it. Meanwhile, I got back in touch with the colleague who had been documenting Jennifer's relationship with her boss. I thanked her for helping me and let her know that everything she'd collected would be useful in my case. I could tell she felt bad for me. She even apologized, saying she'd considered telling me months ago but wasn't sure it was her place. I told her not to worry, that I appreciated her honesty now, that this information would help me put an end to the lies. And then I made a decision I knew would shake Jennifer's world completely. I pulled the kids out of school for a couple of days and took them on a quick trip to see my parents. I didn't give her much of an explanation, just said we'd be back in a few days and left it at that. She looked surprised but didn't push, just gave me a half-hearted "have fun" as we headed out the door. Once we were out of town, I sat down with my parents and explained everything. They were shocked, of course. They'd always liked Jennifer, always thought we were the perfect couple. But as I went through the details, showing them the proof, they looked at me with a mixture of sadness and anger. My mom reached out, putting a hand on my shoulder, and said, "Michael, you don't deserve this. We're here for you and the kids, whatever you need." That trip gave me some clarity. I needed to protect my kids from what was coming, and I needed to stay calm, stay focused. This was going to be messy, no doubt about it, but I was ready. I'd do whatever it took to make sure Jennifer felt the full weight of her betrayal. When we got back home, I didn't say anything about the divorce yet. Instead, I kept things civil, kept up the same quiet routine. Jennifer barely seemed to notice. She was too wrapped up in her own problems. Work was turning into a nightmare for her, and she'd started having more and more arguments with her boss. I'd catch her muttering angrily about him, saying he was being distant and difficult, not giving her the support she needed. The irony of it was almost laughable. Then came the day I'd been waiting for. I had everything prepared, the divorce papers, the evidence, the official complaint to her company, all lined up and ready to go. I walked into the kitchen one evening after the kids were in bed and told Jennifer we needed to talk. She looked up, probably expecting another one of my concerned husband talks. She had no idea what was coming. I laid the folder on the table, looking her straight in the eye as I did. "You need to see this," I said, my voice steady. She looked at the folder, her face paling as she realized what it was. Her hand hovered over it for a moment before she picked it up, flipping through the pages. I watched her face go from confusion to shock to panic. She looked up at me, her mouth opening and closing like she wanted to say something, but no words came out. "I know everything," I said, barely keeping my voice steady. "Every lie, every secret. I know about your boss, the hotels, the texts where you made fun of me to him. I know all of it, Jennifer." She sat there, stunned, her eyes filling with tears. "Michael, I can explain," she whispered. But I didn't let her finish. "I don't want an explanation," I said, my voice cold. "I want you to know that I'm done. I'm done with the lies, the betrayal, the games. I'm filing for divorce, and I'm taking everything you care about with me." For once, she was speechless. She just sat there, looking down at the folder in front of her, her hands shaking. Jennifer sat there, frozen, her face draining of color as the reality of it hit her. I think she finally understood that her games were over, that there was no talking her way out of this. But she still tried. Please," she finally managed, her voice cracking. It wasn't what it looked like. I didn't mean for any of this to happen. I was just going through a hard time." I had to fight back a bitter laugh. She was really going to stand there and make excuses, try to twist things to make herself look like the victim. "A hard time?" I repeated, my voice barely a whisper. "You think that justifies lying to me for months? Sneaking around, laughing about it behind my back?" She didn't know what to say, so she just looked at me with wide, tear-filled eyes. "It wasn't serious, Michael. I swear. I still love you, I do. I made a mistake. A terrible mistake. A mistake," I repeated. "A mistake is forgetting an anniversary. A mistake is leaving the oven on. What you did was deliberate, Jennifer. You lied to me every single day. You laughed at me. You let some other man into your life, into our life." She shook her head, her hands wringing nervously. I know I messed up. But we can fix this, can't we? We can go to counseling, work through it together. I want to fix this, Michael. I don't want to lose everything." But her words were hollow, and I could see through them. It was like she was saying what she thought I wanted to hear, just desperate to stop the freefall. "This isn't something you fix," I said quietly. "Not this time." She started to reach for my hand, but I pulled back. "Jennifer, I don't think you understand. I've already filed for divorce. I have everything set up. There's no counseling, no fixing this. I trusted you, and you turned our marriage into a joke." The tears spilled over as she slumped back into the chair, shoulders shaking. "Please, Michael. I know I don't deserve it, but please. Don't take the kids from me. They're all I have left. I'll do anything, just don't take them." I'd expected her to try to turn this into a pity plea, and honestly, I had thought a lot about the kids. They loved her. Whatever mess she'd made, they didn't deserve to lose their mom. But I wasn't about to let her just walk away without facing the full consequences. "Here's what's going to happen," I said, my voice firm. "We're going to share custody. You'll still see them, but I'm making it clear to them, to everyone, why this is happening. I'm not going to lie for you, Jennifer. They're going to know what you did." Her eyes filled with a mixture of anger and desperation. "Michael, they don't need to know everything. They're kids. They'll hate me. Then maybe you should have thought about that before you started sneaking around, I shot back. I didn't ask for any of this. You created this mess, not me. She buried her face in her hands, sobbing quietly. I couldn't bring myself to feel sorry for her anymore. This was the same woman who'd laughed with her boss about my cluelessness, who'd mocked me while I'd been doing everything I could to support her and keep our family together. I didn't care how many tears she shed now. It was too little, too late. I'll be moving out, I told her after a long silence, my voice cold. I've already set up a place. I'll take the kids for a few days, and we'll tell them together once I'm gone. Jennifer looked up, her eyes red and swollen, but she said nothing. Maybe she finally realized there was no saving face, no manipulating her way out of this one. We were done. The next day, I started packing up my things. I kept it quiet, making sure the kids didn't catch on yet. Jennifer stayed in our room most of the day, probably hoping I'd come in, maybe reconsider or give her some kind of forgiveness. But I didn't. Every time I thought about even softening my stance, I remembered those messages, the photos, and every moment she disrespected me and our family. By the end of the day, I had my things loaded up. Jennifer came down, her face pale, as I told her I'd take the kids to my parents' place for a few days. We'd agreed to sit them down together and explain that we'd be separating. She looked like she was about to break, but I didn't care anymore. She'd made her choice. I turned to leave, and as I walked out the door, I heard her whisper, "I'm so sorry, Michael." I didn't even turn around. Yeah. You should be. Taking the kids to my parents' place felt surreal. They had no idea what was going on, and I tried to keep things light, make it seem like a little adventure, but my heart was heavy. How do you explain to your own kids that everything they know is about to change? We got to my parents' house in the early evening, and my mom immediately noticed something was wrong. She shot me a look, silently asking if I was okay, but I just shook my head. I couldn't get into it yet, not in front of the kids. She understood and kept things upbeat, distracting the kids while I unloaded our bags and settled in. That night, after the kids were asleep, I sat down with my parents. They were both quiet at first, watching me, waiting for me to say something. Finally, I just came out with it. Jennifer and I are done. I'm filing for divorce. My mom gasped, covering her mouth, and my dad's expression went from shock to anger. What happened? He asked, his voice low. I explained everything, her lies, the affairs, how she'd been seeing her boss and God knows who else. I told them about the evidence, the texts, the way she'd been mocking me behind my back. It was like every word I said made it feel more real, more final. By the end of it, my mom was in tears, and my dad looked like he was ready to explode. I don't understand, my mom whispered. How could she, after everything you did for her, for the family? My dad shook his head, jaw clenched. She doesn't deserve you, Michael. And the kids, how could she throw everything away like this? I nodded, feeling that same anger, that same bewilderment that I'd been carrying for days. I don't know, Dad. I thought I knew her, thought we'd built this life together. Turns out it was all just a lie. My parents hugged me, holding me close, and for a moment, I felt the weight of everything lift, just slightly. I'd been bottling it all up, trying to be strong for the kids, but now, finally, I could let some of it out. It was a comfort I hadn't realized I needed. The next morning, I spent some time with the kids, taking them out for a walk around the neighborhood and answering their usual questions. When are we going home? And is Mom coming too? I tried to dodge the questions, telling them we'd be back soon and that we'd talk more about things later. It felt like a ticking time bomb. By the time we got back, Jennifer had called several times. I ignored every single one. I could imagine her sitting in our house, feeling the full weight of her actions finally crashing down. For once, she was the one left in the dark, wondering what was going to happen next. That evening, I took the kids back to the house. Jennifer was waiting by the door, looking like she hadn't slept a wink. Her face was pale, her eyes red and swollen, and she looked at me with this desperate, pleading expression. But I just brushed past her, guiding the kids inside and telling them to get ready for bed. Once they were upstairs, Jennifer followed me into the kitchen, her voice barely above a whisper. Did you tell them? I shook my head. Oh. We'll tell them together, like we agreed. But I'm not lying for you. They'll know the truth, At least, as much as they need to. She nodded slowly, her eyes filling with tears again. Michael, I can't believe I let it get to this point. I was stupid, and I don't expect you to forgive me, but please, let's make this as easy on the kids as we can. The nerve of it, her asking for mercy for the sake of the kids. I felt a surge of anger but forced myself to stay calm. I'm already doing that, Jennifer. I could have blown this up from the start, told them everything right away, but I didn't. I'm giving you a chance to at least save face with them. She broke down again, tears streaming down her face as she choked out an apology. But it felt empty, like she was only sorry because she'd been caught. I just looked at her, feeling numb, feeling like the person standing in front of me was a stranger. We spent the next couple of days in this strange, tense limbo. Jennifer was quieter than usual, spending time with the kids and trying to act like everything was fine, but the kids could sense something was off. They'd glance between us during meals, frowning, like they were picking up on the tension, but too afraid to ask. Finally, on the third day, I decided it was time. Jennifer and I called the kids into the living room and sat them down. She looked at me, her eyes pleading, but I just nodded for her to start. She took a shaky breath and said, "Mom and Dad, well, we've decided we're not going to be living together anymore." The kids stared at her, wide-eyed, as the reality of her words sank in. Our oldest, Emily, looked at me, her face scrunched up in confusion. "Why?" Jennifer opened her mouth to speak, but I cut in. "Sometimes, people make mistakes," I said gently. "And those mistakes hurt the people they love. But that doesn't change how much we both love you." Emily didn't look satisfied with that answer, and I could tell she was about to ask more questions. But I couldn't get into it, not yet. We reassured them that we'd still both be there for them, that they'd still see us both. But even as we said the words, I could feel their little worlds breaking apart, and it killed me. After we put them to bed, I stood outside their room, just listening to the quiet. Jennifer came up beside me, looking like she wanted to say something. But I turned and walked away, leaving her there in the hallway. That was the last time I ever looked at her with anything close to sympathy. From that moment on, I was focused on one thing: making sure the kids came through this as unscathed as possible. And if that meant pushing Jennifer out of my life completely, then so be it. In the days that followed, the reality of everything started to settle in. The house felt different, emptier somehow, even though we were all still living under the same roof. I'd moved my things into the guest room, barely seeing Jennifer except when we were with the kids. We kept up the appearance of normalcy, but it was all an act. I could tell the kids sensed it, picking up on the distance between us, the careful way we avoided each other's gaze. Jennifer tried to approach me a few times, always looking like she was hoping for a miracle, hoping I'd somehow forget everything and go back to the way things were. She'd corner me in the kitchen or catch me in the hallway, her voice soft and pleading. "Michael, can we just talk? Please. I don't know how we got here. Maybe we could try counseling?" But every time I shut her down. "There's nothing left to talk about, Jennifer," I'd say, walking away without looking back. I wasn't about to let her rewrite the past, to turn this into some fixable misunderstanding. There was no way to fix what she'd done. I'd accepted that, even if she hadn't. After a week of this strange, cold routine, I got a call from my lawyer. The divorce was moving forward, and soon Jennifer would be served the official papers. I'd asked him to handle everything discreetly, keeping the details out of the kids' reach. It felt like the only bit of control I had left in a situation that had spiraled so far out of my hands. The next day, Jennifer's life started to unravel even more. Her company caught wind of the lawsuit I'd filed. They'd already been investigating her relationship with her boss, but my complaint added fuel to the fire. She was called into a meeting with HR, where they went through every allegation, every rumor. I knew this because she came home that evening looking absolutely wrecked, her face pale and her hands shaking as she set her things down. I was in the living room, pretending to read a book, but I could feel her eyes on me. "You filed a complaint with my company?" she finally said, her voice shaking with anger. I looked up, meeting her gaze without an ounce of sympathy. "I did. You're not the only one who gets to act without thinking about the consequences, Jennifer." She clenched her fists, like she was struggling to keep her composure. You've ruined everything, Michael. My career, my reputation, everything. I let out a short, bitter laugh. I ruined everything? I'm not the one who dragged our marriage through the mud. You did that all on your own. She took a shaky breath, trying to compose herself. Do you have any idea what this will do to me? To us? That's where you're wrong, I said, my voice flat. There is no us anymore. You made sure of that. I'm just finishing what you started. Her expression crumpled, and for a second, I saw a flash of regret in her eyes, maybe even a hint of the person she used to be. But I couldn't feel sorry for her, not after everything she'd done. She was just upset because she was finally facing the consequences. Over the next few days, the fallout at her job got worse. Her boss was placed on administrative leave, and Jennifer's colleagues were whispering, giving her looks she couldn't ignore. She'd come home tense, avoiding my gaze as she buried herself in her phone or retreated to her room, looking more defeated with each passing day. One evening, I came home to find her sitting at the kitchen table, head in her hands. She looked up as I walked in, her face streaked with tears. They're going to fire me, Michael. I can feel it. HR's already asking me to hand over my emails, my phone records. I shrugged, barely able to muster any emotion. Maybe you should have thought about that before you turned our marriage into a joke. Actions have consequences, Jennifer. You taught me that. She gave a bitter laugh, wiping her eyes. So this is revenge, then? You wanted to watch me lose everything? I shook my head. No, Jennifer. I wanted to have a marriage I could believe in. I wanted a wife I could trust, a family that was whole. But you threw that away, and now you're dealing with the fallout. This isn't revenge. It's reality. For a moment, she just sat there, looking at me like she didn't even recognize me. And maybe she didn't, because I was no longer the husband who'd put her on a pedestal, who'd been willing to forgive and forget. She'd killed that part of me with every lie, every betrayal. That night, I took a long walk around the neighborhood, trying to clear my head. I thought about the future, about what things would look like once the divorce was final. I thought about the kids, how I'd have to explain all of this to them one day, how they'd eventually understand the full truth. The weight of it all pressed down on me, but I knew I was doing the right thing. This wasn't just about me. It was about giving my kids a stable life, free from the lies and deceit Jennifer had brought into our home. When I got back, Jennifer was already in bed. I went to the guest room, lay down, and stared at the ceiling, thinking about how quickly things had fallen apart. This wasn't the life I'd envisioned, not by a long shot. But as painful as it was, I knew it was better than living in a lie. The next morning, I got up early, packed a bag, and took the kids to my parents' place for the weekend. I needed a break from the constant tension, and the kids needed a change of scenery. They deserved to be surrounded by people who loved them unconditionally, people who wouldn't betray their trust. And as I drove, watching them laughing and playing in the back seat, I made a silent vow. I would give them a life they could count on, even if it meant rebuilding everything from scratch. That weekend with the kids at my parents' place was like a breath of fresh air. For the first time in weeks, I felt a bit of relief, like a weight had been lifted off my shoulders. The kids seemed happier too, laughing and playing with my mom and dad, running around in the backyard without a care in the world. Watching them, I felt a renewed sense of purpose. No matter how rough things got, I'd make sure they'd come out of this okay. My parents were a huge support, taking the kids to a nearby lake, going on hikes, making them feel safe and loved. My dad pulled me aside a few times to talk, asking how I was holding up, if there was anything he could do to help. Just having someone listen was more than I could ask for. We talked about the divorce, the details, the plans I had for custody, and the new life I was trying to piece together. He gave me some advice, told me to stay strong for the kids, and reminded me that I'd always have their support. Sunday night came too quickly, and I could feel the dread creeping back in as we packed up and got ready to head home. The kids were tired but happy, waving goodbye to my parents as we pulled out of the driveway. I tried to keep the mood light, asking them about their favorite parts of the weekend and laughing along with their stories. But as we got closer to home, that tension settled back over me. When we finally arrived, the house was dark except for a single light on in the kitchen. Jennifer was sitting at the table, staring down at a pile of papers. She looked up as we walked in, her face a mix of anger and exhaustion. I got the kids settled upstairs, letting them unpack and get ready for bed, then came back down to face her. "You just left without saying anything," she said quietly, her voice tight with frustration. "Do you have any idea what it's like to sit here, wondering where you went, wondering if you're even coming back?" I raised an eyebrow, barely able to believe what I was hearing. I took the kids to see my parents. "I needed a break, Jennifer, and so did they. You can't blame me for wanting to give them a bit of normalcy after everything you've put us through." She closed her eyes, taking a deep breath. I know I messed up, Michael. But I don't think you understand what this is doing to me. I've lost my job, I'm losing my family. Everything I care about is slipping through my fingers, and it's like you're just sitting back and watching it happen." I could feel my anger flaring up, the old resentment bubbling to the surface. "Jennifer, you had every chance to stop this. You made the choice to lie, to betray me, to jeopardize our family. You're dealing with the consequences of your actions. Don't put that on me." She looked away, her shoulders slumping in defeat. I thought, maybe we could still fix things. For the kids, if nothing else. I shook my head, the words coming out before I could stop them. "There's no fixing this. You and I are done, Jennifer. I'll be civil for the kids' sake, but that's it." She stared at me, searching my face like she was looking for a hint of mercy, of forgiveness. But there was nothing left to give. She'd burned through every bit of trust, every ounce of love I'd once felt for her. All I had left was the resolve to protect my kids and rebuild a life where they could feel safe. The days turned into weeks, and our lives shifted into this strange, fractured routine. Jennifer stayed at the house for now, but we lived like strangers, barely speaking except when it came to the kids. I took on more of the parenting responsibilities, making sure the kids had some kind of stability while Jennifer scrambled to piece her life back together. She'd lost her job, her reputation, and was trying to pick up freelance work to keep herself afloat, but it wasn't enough. I could see the toll it was taking on her, but I forced myself to stay detached. Every now and then, she'd try to reach out, apologizing or trying to explain herself, but I kept my distance. I wasn't interested in her apologies or her regrets. That ship had sailed, and as far as I was concerned, there was no going back. One evening, after putting the kids to bed, I sat down in the guest room and started going through my options for the future. I looked up apartments, thinking about where I could move once the divorce was finalized, thinking about what kind of life I wanted to build for myself and the kids. It felt strange, imagining a life without Jennifer in it, but there was also a sense of freedom, a hint of hope that maybe, just maybe, we could all be happier in the long run. I was deep in thought when I heard a knock on the door. Jennifer stood there, looking lost, holding a photo album in her hands. "Michael," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I know you don't want to hear it, but can we look through these? Just for a minute?" I stared at her, tempted to tell her to leave, to remind her that memories don't change the damage she caused. But for some reason, maybe out of habit, maybe out of exhaustion, I nodded. She sat down on the edge of the bed, flipping open the album. Photos of our wedding, of the kids when they were babies, of holidays and family gatherings, all the pieces of the life we'd built, now scattered like ashes. She pointed at a picture of us, young and smiling, eyes full of hope for the future. "Do you remember this?" she asked, her voice thick with emotion. I looked at the photo, feeling a pang of something, loss, maybe, or just the weight of everything that could have been. "Yeah," I said finally. "I remember." For a long moment, we just sat there, looking through those snapshots of a life that was gone, a life we'd both lost. She started to cry, her shoulders shaking, but I couldn't bring myself to comfort her. All I could think was, this is what betrayal costs. This is what happens when trust is broken beyond repair. Finally, I closed the album, handing it back to her. "Jennifer, I appreciate the memories. But that's all they are now, just memories. We can't change what's happened." She nodded, wiping her tears, looking more defeated than I'd ever seen her. "I know," she whispered. I just wish things had turned out differently." With that, she got up and left, leaving me alone with the silence and the memories of a life that felt like it belonged to someone else. And in that moment, I knew there was no going back. Not for us, not for the family we'd once been. The only way forward was to let go, to pick up the pieces and start again. So here I am, Read It. It's been months since all of this started, and looking back, it feels like a different lifetime. A life I thought I'd be living forever, but that ended in a way I never expected. There's no denying the grief that comes with that, the loss of what I thought was my future, my family. But in the end, it's the betrayal that hurts the most, the knowledge that the person I trusted more than anyone chose to lie to me over and over without a second thought. I'd be lying if I said I was over it, or that I didn't still feel the sting every now and then, especially when I look at our kids and think about how they'll grow up knowing their parents couldn't make it work. But I've come to accept that not everything is in my control. Some things, like loyalty and honesty, can't be forced. You either have them or you don't. There's a part of me that wants to be bitter, that wants to stay angry forever. But then I look at my kids, and I realize that's not who I want to be. I want to give them a stable, loving home, and I want to show them that it's possible to move forward even when you've been hurt. If there's anything I've learned from this, it's that healing isn't about getting back what you lost. It's about finding something new, something solid that can't be torn apart by lies and deceit. Jennifer and I share custody now, and I keep things civil for the kids' sake. I'm not interested in revenge, not anymore. The life she built on secrets and deception is hers to live with. As for me, I'm focused on rebuilding. It's been slow and sometimes feels like 2 steps forward, 1 step back, but I'm getting there. I've found an apartment, set up a life that's mine, and started to feel like I can breathe again. Maybe someday, I'll look back on all of this and feel nothing but gratitude that I got out when I did. Because at the end of the day, I learned that trust is everything. Once it's gone, there's no way to glue it back together. And while that might sound harsh, it's the truth. So if anyone's reading this, going through something similar, all I can say is, don't settle for anything less than the real thing. It might be painful to let go, but in the long run, holding on to something fake is even worse. Thanks for reading, and for giving me a place to get all of this out. It hasn't been easy, but here's to moving forward and finding something real again.